Hi, I'm Selena and welcome to my October wrap-up, or a video where I tell you about all the books that I read in October. But first, before we get into stats and everything, I just wanted to give honorable mentions to the books that I am still reading. There is 4 of them, and the first one is one that has been on this currently reading place for like over a month at this point. This is the second wrap-up that I've had to say this, but I am still reading Rage of Dragons. But I am getting closer to the end, so I should definitely have this done by next month, and you'll see it in my next month's wrap-up. You will also see some books that I am varying degrees of far into, and they are Unmarriageable by Sonia Kamal, Haroon in the Sea of Stories by Salman Rushdie, and The Shining by Stephen King. And if you are interested in seeing my progress through those books, then you can check out my weekly reading vlogs, because I vlog pretty much every week, and I will be vlogging about those in the coming weeks. So I read 12 things this month. 8 of those things were novels. 1 of those things was like a short story collection thing. 2 of those things were novellas, and 1 thing of those things was a graphic novel. As far as age ranges go, I read 1 middle grade, 4 YA books, and 7 adult books. And as far as genres, I read 5 fantasy books this month, 3 horror books, 1 sci-fi, 1 historical fiction, 1 contemporary, and, oh yes, 1 thriller. So a pretty wide range of genres, a lot of genres I don't usually read. We'll get into it later. For my ratings, I didn't have any 1 stars, but I did have 1 2-star, and I had 4 3 stars and 5 4 stars, and then only 2 5 stars. So I mostly enjoyed everything I read. I just didn't love a lot of what I read this month, which is, you know, fine. Okay, so let's just jump into my 2-star book. So this is technically, I think I gave it a 2.5 star, but honestly, it could just be a 2-star. I don't really care about the rating for this book because I didn't care about this book, and that book is Longbourn by Joe Baker. So this is a historical fiction. It is a modern novel written about the Regency period, and specifically Longbourn, the title, comes from the book Pride and Prejudice. This is sort of a retelling of Pride and Prejudice, but it focuses on different people. If you read Pride and Prejudice, you know that Longbourn is where the main character lives. The main character's family owns an estate called Longbourn, and this book follows the servants of that estate who are barely mentioned in Pride and Prejudice. And so Joe Baker, with this book, likely meant to give a voice to people who were cut out of Jane Austen's narrative largely. I understand the intentions behind this book, but as you can see from my rating, I just really didn't like it. And I think what it comes down to is the execution was just really not for me. Historical fiction is a hit or miss genre anyway. I love a lot of them and I don't care about a lot of them. And I just found this one to be boring. I thought the writing style was really dry, and I thought that the characters were really one note. There were a few that I felt were more complex, but a lot of them I didn't feel like there was anything unique about them that got me invested in them. There was also barely any plot to this book, and the plot that did run through this book was largely a romance plot, and I just don't care about romance that much. Like, if the romance is the only plot, then that can sometimes be, that's like probably my least favorite plot type. I usually want other things to be going on, and I did not really find that the other things in this book were enough to keep me hooked at all. On top of that, I thought that the marginalized people in this book that the book tries to include for a quick second at times were usually portrayed very poorly, very one note, even more one note than the main characters. They were pretty much used as props, and so that wasn't great. It does provide an interesting perspective on the Regency period and Pride and Prejudice, and I do like what this book did with Wickham and Mrs. Bennet. That was really good too. But I didn't care about anything else, pretty much. I do like that this was trying to add a narrative to Pride and Prejudice that Pride and Prejudice doesn't give the time of day to, and I also think that the things that this book added to Pride and Prejudice and interpreted about Pride and Prejudice are totally fair interpretations, and if you're interested in seeing that, checking that out, then I do sort of recommend this to you. If you're someone who likes slow historical fiction with sort of lyrical writing style, you're really just interested in following characters, following romance, then maybe this would be for you, but it just wasn't for me. On to my 3 stars. The lowest 3-star that I had this month was I Don't Want to Kill You by Dan Wells. So this book is book 3 in the John Cleaver series. This is one of my friend Udi's favorite series ever, and so he has wanted me to read these books. He loaned them to me, and I have slowly been making my way through them. This was the conclusion to the first half of the series. I think that Dan Wells continued the series with 3 more books later, set at a later time in the main character John Cleaver's life, and I don't think I'm going to be continuing on with those, but I did read the first half of this series, and it is about this boy who has a lot of murderous impulses, and he uses those impulses basically for good. He controls them, he makes sure he doesn't act on any of them, but when a serial killer starts picking off people in his town, he is able to use those skills to try and find this person. I will tell you that the series is paranormal YA for the first book, and then it transitions into like a paranormal horror, dark fantasy sort of deal with the later books. And I've heard Udi say that the second part of the series that I'm not going to read gets pretty epic, and so it's a lot of different things. If you've followed me for a little bit, you probably know that I have mixed feelings on this series. I didn't really like the first one, and I thought the second one was good, and this third one I had mixed feelings on. I thought some elements of it were really good, and I really didn't like some elements of it. And what I have noticed is that the things that Dan Wells does well, I tend to like those parts in every single book that I've read of his, but the same problems that I have with each book keep coming up. And so I'm not sure if Dan Wells is just not the author for me, but that seems to be my experience so far. But yeah, with I Don't Want to Kill You, I thought the beginning was okay. I liked John's development. Then it just sort of fell apart for me. I had some issues with the way Dan Wells was writing the women characters, and I am not going to go into details there because spoilers, but that's a repeated problem for me, and maybe other people wouldn't have that problem. I just did. But the biggest thing for me was how suicide was used for this plot, and the things that the misinformation basically that this book peddled. I had big issues with it. Mental health is something that I feel very strongly about being covered in the right way in books, even if it is a horror book, which is using a real life problem for its own plot. I still think there's things you can do to make sure you're not playing into really harmful tropes that mentally ill people and suicidal people already have to deal with. And so I think that Dan Wells did not do a good job at avoiding those, but I will say no more about that here. If you would like to know my thoughts and you've already read the book, or you just don't care to read the series, check out my Goodreads review. I will link it in the description. I go into much greater detail on the things I didn't like there, but it is a spoilery review, so just go in knowing that. The next 3.5 star that I read this month was Heartstopper Volume 1, which is the first volume in a currently 3-volume webcomic turned graphic novel series. It is a YA romance. It is LGBTQ+. It is focusing on the romance between these 2 high school age boys who are really just living their own lives, and then they sort of become friends and they develop feelings for each other. It's a very simple plot, and it honestly is a very character-driven romantic plot, and that doesn't tend to be my thing either. I gave it 3 stars because it just didn't stick with me like some other webcomics that I've read have. I thought the romance was fine, and I thought the characters were fine, but I wasn't that invested in them. I'm not super in a hurry to continue with the series. I know that everyone on BookTube really loves this webcomic, and so maybe one day I will, but I just wasn't in love with it like everyone else seems to be. But I do think that this is a good webcomic or graphic novel, and I do think I should continue at least a little bit to see if things change, because this is the first part of a much longer webcomic / graphic novel series. I know that Alice Oseman is still posting it on Tapas, I think, and then they're being published in volumes, and so I know that this is kind of like judging a much larger story by the very beginning of it, and so maybe I will check it out eventually to see where it goes from here. Also, I just wanted to mention, major trigger warning for attempted rape on page. No one talks about that. No one mentions that, and I just think it needs to be mentioned because it was a little disturbing. Other trigger warnings for the books I'm going to talk about, by the way, are going to be in the pinned comment. The next 3.5 star that I read is Lives of Saints by Leigh Bardugo. This is a new book by Leigh Bardugo, which was mentioned in the first Grisha trilogy, Shadow and Bone trilogy thing. This book, Lives of Saints, is featured in the book, and it plays a semi-important role in that book and that trilogy as a whole. And I've wanted her to publish a book like this since I read that trilogy, and so I was really excited when this was announced. But I felt the same way about Language of Thorns. It's not as good as her regular novels. It was fine, it was quick, it was sweet. It had amazing art, There was some interesting lore stuff. There were some connections between this and Language of Thorns and the various series, but it wasn't anything where I was like, this is a new favorite, of course. A lot of stories didn't really stick with me, but they were fine to read them at the time. And I will say that these stories follow the saints of Ravka and the various countries of the Grishaverse world, and sometimes it talks about their origin stories and like how they became saints or something of that sort. And sometimes it just talks about stories about worshippers and like people who were indebted to these saints for the help that they received from them. And I didn't like that as much because it's called The Lives of Saints. If this is the historical book, why are we learning about other people's experience worshiping the saints? I don't know. It was just weird. And there was one story at the end towards the end, where I was hoping to see a different interpretation, and it was a story about worshipers. And so I was like, oh man. And then there was also a last story, which I was not expecting, but I mean, it's interesting. I honestly wouldn't recommend this if you are not a big Grisha fan, because it's not anything that you need to read the series or to enjoy it. I just am a huge fan, so I got this. And then the final 3.5 star book novella that I read is The Ballad of Black Tom by Victor LaValle. So I've read one book by Victor LaValle before, The Changeling, and I loved that one. And so I've wanted to get into his stuff for a while. This is a short horror dark fantasy story, which I wanted to read during Halloween, and so I did. I read it actually in the spooky 24-hour readathon, which I will link in the cards if you want to check that out. Did I say 24-hour? I meant 12-hour. I didn't read for 24 hours. Don't get your hopes up. So this story is about a man whose name I don't remember, despite just, I mean, his name is Tommy, I think. He goes by different names, but his name that we heard him referred to as for most of the story was Tommy. Or Tom. So Tommy basically is a black man living in Harlem during the 1920s, I believe, and he makes his money off of, I don't remember what he called himself, but he makes his money off of selling more occult items to prospective buyers and things, and also maybe playing the guitar at different venues. I'm not really sure anymore. But he basically cons people. He's also sort of a con artist. This plot basically starts when Tommy basically sells this book to a woman that is not normal. I don't really know how to describe this. He basically falls in with a crowd that is trying to awake a certain supernatural power. I don't really know how to describe this better than that without spoiling things. I do know that this is a retelling or a Lovecraftian type story based off of the horror at Red Hook, or of Red Hook or something, which is one of Lovecraft's most wildly racist short stories. I was going to read that, but I quickly figured that out and I was like, no thank you, I'm just going to take my chances with the Ballad of Black Tom. This was short and interesting, but I also found it confusing at times. I don't know that LaValle wrapped up everything that his story promised, or at least I didn't feel like it did. I feel like I still had a lot of questions, and maybe that's just my fault. I listened to this on audiobook. I don't know, maybe I missed something. But I didn't love it as much as The Changeling because I did think there were threads that didn't get closed. And I don't know whether that is because I should have read the Lovecraft story or at least should have been more familiar with it, but I wasn't. So I don't know. It was good. It was an enjoyable read, but it's not my new favorite horror or anything. Moving on to my 4 stars, we have a reread of mine, which was A Wizard of Earthsea by Ursula K. Le Guin. So this is a slightly older, high epic fantasy novel. This is one of the first YA fantasies I know, and we follow this wizard named Ged as he is growing up in this expansive world called Earthsea, and training to be a magician. But he accidentally gets a little prideful and messes around with his powers and unleashes something that continues to haunt his tracks. And so this book is that story, and we follow Ged growing up, and it's very character driven. It's very slow, but good. I enjoyed this a lot more the second time around. I generally need more of a plot than this, and the first time I read this, I did feel that way, but the second time I really felt like this was a life story that moved slow and sometimes felt a little meandering, but had such good payoff that I didn't mind it anymore. I also just found Ursula K. Le Guin's writing to be really good, really immersive, and her magic system and world building to be really fresh, even for 2020. Where we have a lot more YA and adult epic fantasy now. I still found that this had a lot of uniqueness to it and just a lot that was subverted and just refreshing. I do think I will continue with the series, but I don't think I will do it anytime soon. The next 4-star that I read is When No One Is Watching by Alyssa Cole. This is a thriller novel about gentrification. We follow a Black woman whose neighborhood is being gentrified, and something is going on. People are giving up their houses for various circumstances in their lives, and they're selling it to this company that is sort of eating up the neighborhood and inputting a lot of new white inhabitants into it. So our main character, Sydney, faces a lot of hostility from the people around in the neighborhood who've just moved in, and we also follow one of the newer white inhabitants who moves into a house with his girlfriend, and so they strike up a friendship, but there is something larger going on, and it becomes imperative that she figures this out because things start to get intense. This book is so full of suspense in just everyday life ways. There are so many times where I was on the edge of my seat and scared, even though there wasn't technically anything going on that I should have been that scared about. Or like, this is a very slow thriller. I'm not trying to say that this like isn't a thriller or anything, but it's a very slow thriller with very day-to-day things that are going on. This isn't very commercial or dramatic, and I really loved that. It made it so much more suspenseful for me, and it really tapped into some of my fears. I'm sure it tapped into a lot of its readers' fears that kind of creep into your mind, or like the worst case scenarios that you can think of. And these are things that could happen, that do happen. And so the way that Alyssa Cole was able to create this thriller out of those things, it was just masterful and thrilling and so intense at times. It kept me guessing the whole way through. It kept me interested the whole way through. There was some moments where a romance develops, and I didn't love those scenes, but I don't really know exactly what the narrative purpose was, but I mean, it's fine. As we know, I'm not a romance reader, so of course I didn't care about the romance. But yeah, other than that, I really, really enjoyed this, and I do recommend it, highly recommend it if you're interested in a slow but suspenseful and very well written thriller. On to my 4.5 stars. I do just want to mention the 2 classics that I read that I gave 4.5 stars. I read Fellowship of the Ring and Kindred, and so I talked about both of these in my classics wrap-up, and I gave them both 4.5 stars. You can go check that video out. It will be linked in the eye, and so if you want to see that, then you can see my more in-depth thoughts. I do have spoiler warnings and timestamps and things, so you can skip around if you only are interested in some of them, so check that out. And the last 4.5 star that I read was City of Ghosts by Victoria Schwab, which I actually read in my 12-hour spooky readathon. And so again, linked in the cards if you want to see my, as I'm reading it, thoughts on it. This was a cute, slightly spooky, middle grade fantasy, I would say, about a girl named Cassidy Blake who, after a near-death experience, can see ghosts and has a ghost best friend who is technically haunting her. And her parents are also really into the paranormal, but in a sort of commercial, purely theoretical sort of way, but they've made a lot of money off of some books that they've published about the paranormal, both the history and the mythos of various places. And so they get a TV deal where they are going to go to the world's most haunted places and talk about it to their viewership. And Cassidy is taken with them to Scotland, Edinburgh, which is very haunted. And so Cassidy's connection to the ghostly realm gets even stronger in Scotland, but it starts to threaten her in a way that it didn't before. And so I'm not gonna say any more than that. I thought this was a really cute short book. I thought that this had a good premise. I thought that this had a good setting. I really enjoyed the ghost world thing that Cassidy enters in and out of. I wasn't scared by this book, but it was, you know, just like a spooky vibe. I really enjoyed Cassidy as the main character, and I really enjoyed the friendship that was in the middle of this book between Cassidy and Jacob, which is her ghost best friend who is haunting her. I really loved that friendship. I thought it carried this book a long ways for me, and I really enjoyed it. I thought it was cute. On to the 5 stars. For my first 5-star, I'm gonna redirect you to my classics wrap up yet again, because the 5-star is Carmilla by Sheridan Le Fanu, which I talk about in much greater detail in the classics wrap up, so I'm not gonna talk about it here, but you can check that out if you're interested. I loved this book so much. And then the final book I'm going to talk to you about, my favorite book that I read this month, was Starsight by Brandon Sanderson. So this is the second in the Skyward series. Skyward is the first one. I really enjoyed the sequel. This series follows a girl named Spensa on the planet Detritus. She is part of the remains of the humanity of Earth, the human population of Earth, which fled to Detritus many generations ago. And Spensa really wants to be a pilot, but that is made very hard for her because her father was a pilot and deemed a coward and shot down by his own fleet once he fled from the enemy. And so Spensa wants to be a pilot, but is in this world where no one trusts her in a very political piloting program. And so book 1 basically follows Spensa's personal journey trying to fight the system and sort of get in and be able to be a pilot and prove everyone wrong. Starsight is a lot more plot, and it really takes off from where Skyward leaves off, and I can't really tell you anything more than that. I love this book. It solidified Skyward as one of my favorite series. I think this book went exactly where the Skyward series needed to go. It went in a very different direction that I was not expecting, but I love. Sometimes sequels can just repeat what the first book did, or not put enough of a spin on it, and sometimes that works and sometimes it doesn't, and this went exactly where the series needed to go, and it was so good. It was so good. There were so many new characters I loved the plot of this. I just loved this book. It was a delight reading this for the week or something that I was reading it. So these are some of the books that I read in the month of October. Thank you for watching my wrap up, and I will see you in my next video. Bye.